What's the creepiest thing you've seen in a remote or isolated place? I can't take credit for this story because it happened to my younger brother, but it is so unsettling that he still doesn't like to talk about it. My twin brother and I were in college at the time, and our younger brother was a junior in high school. He was the only sibling still living at home, and his bedroom was on one end of the house. We live out in the country, truly in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but farmland in every direction. Our house is a long, rectangular layout. My parents' master suite is on one end, and the bedrooms for us kids are on the complete opposite end. Between them is an open-concept kitchen, dining room, and living room. If both bedroom doors were open, you could see straight from one end of the house to the other. My younger brother is a big guy, about 6 feet 4 inches tall and around 250 pounds. One afternoon, he got home from football practice around 4:30 or 5 o'clock. He said he was completely alone. Our mom is a school teacher, and our dad farms and also works in town, so both of them were still at work. He came in through the back door and walked through the living room toward his bedroom, which was at the end of the hallway opposite our parents' room. To explain what happened next, the layout matters. As you leave the living room and enter the hallway, there are 4 doors. The first door on the right was my bedroom, and directly across from it was the shared bathroom for the 3 of us. Farther down the hallway, the second door on the left was my twin brother's room. At the very end of the hall was my younger brother's bedroom. His room had a small entry area before the main bedroom. When you opened the door, you stepped into a short space and then turned immediately to the right to enter the main part of the room. If his bedroom door was open and you were standing in the hallway, all you could see was that small entry area facing a wall, with light spilling in from the right. As he walked through the living room and reached the entrance to the hallway, he glanced down toward his open bedroom door. He said he didn't know why, but a deep pit formed in his stomach, and every hair on his arm stood on end. Something felt wrong, and he froze. Standing in the hallway and staring at his bedroom door, he said he saw something begin to peer around the doorway. He told us he knew exactly what it was, but the only way he could describe it was, it looked like my forehead was peeking around the doorframe, getting ready to look right at me. He immediately felt that he was not supposed to see whatever was about to come fully into view. Without thinking, he bolted left into the bathroom and slammed the door shut. He pressed his back against it and then heard someone running down the hallway, past the bathroom, and into the living room. The worst part came next. He could hear whoever it was, slowly walking back down the hallway toward the bathroom, stopping just outside the door, and standing there. Cell reception where we live is terrible, so he tried calling our parents but couldn't reach either of them. He stayed in the bathroom, braced against the door, for about an hour until our mom finally came home. He said that until she arrived, he could tell someone was still on the other side of that door. When he told us the story later, we laughed and joked that maybe it was his doppelganger coming for him. He absolutely believes it was something like that. He said he was terrified in that moment, and just knew he was not meant to see whatever was coming around that door. He's still afraid to stay alone on that end of the house, and now he's 27. Story 2. First, yes, I've done drugs in my life, but I was completely clean for months when this happened. I know what I saw. I just can't explain how it was there. I used to live in northern Canada, not way up in the territories, but far enough north that it snowed 7 or 8 months out of the year. Lots of forest, a small city, and huge stretches of wilderness on all sides. Bears, cougars, wolves, coyotes, moose, everything you'd expect. I lived at the bottom of a hill at the edge of the forest and saw bears constantly, at least half a dozen every summer, and moose once or twice a year. I also used to go on late-night walks pretty often. The road was secluded. Forest on one side, flat land on the other, with streetlights every couple hundred feet. One night, I saw something wrong. I know I'm just some person on the internet, but I swear on the life of my dead best friend that this is exactly how I remember it. I was walking home around 2 or 3 in the morning in mid-July. I was a couple of kilometers from home, a route I'd walked dozens of times. I'd been followed by bears before, but they usually took off as soon as a truck came by. I carried bear mace, so I wasn't too worried. As I walked, I noticed something in the flat land beside the road, about half a kilometer wide. I saw a yellow eye just sitting there, attached to a pear-shaped black body. It looked like a black bear lying down. It was maybe 300 or 400 feet away, and the streetlight was in my eyes when I first noticed it. I kept walking, but stayed alert and reached for my bear mace. When I looked again, it started moving, but not like a bear, or a moose, or a cougar, or a wolf. The moonlight silhouetted it once my eyes adjusted. I checked again and again to make sure I was really seeing this. It was hunched over, almost bipedal. It moved something like an ape, but its torso and limbs were wrong. They were narrow, and it looked like it was draped in torn fabric or loose fur. When it moved, Its limbs stretch farther than they should have. Its arms look nearly as long as its upper body. That's when the fear hit. Everything slowed down. My thoughts raced and I started walking. Faster without breaking eye contact. It adjusted its movement to match mine, slowly turning toward the road. Living up north, you know a bear can outrun you, so the safest thing is usually to stop and let it go about its business. So I stopped. It stopped. I stood perfectly still in the darkness between streetlights, staring at its silhouette and those yellow eyes. Time felt frozen. I held my breath, praying it would leave. Instead, it started moving again, angling toward the road in this strange, shambling way. It was now maybe 100 feet away, heading toward a streetlight at the pace of someone walking aimlessly. As it came closer, I felt relief. I told myself it was just a bear. I'd scared myself over nothing. It probably smelled food in someone's trash. I wish that had been true. This thing shouldn't exist. I swear it looked like a starved bear with legs far too long. Its fur was torn and hanging loose. Its face was caved in, with flesh missing on one side. It moved like a sick, suffering ape, dragging itself across the pavement. Then it made a sound, somewhere between a growl and a groan inside a metal container. I've never heard anything like it. As it moved, I saw that its back left leg was barely attached. It was still connected, but it didn't move at all, just dead weight. Mostly bone. I tried to scream, but my throat locked up. I couldn't even breathe. I stood there crying, convinced this couldn't be real. It crawled across the road and disappeared into the forest, rustling through the brush. I was still staring when headlights appeared behind me. A pickup truck came around the bend about half a kilometer away. I ran toward it, waving my arms and screaming for help. The driver saw me and sped past without stopping. I kept running, all the way home. I burst through the door, slammed it shut, and collapsed on the floor, sobbing. The only explanation I can come up with is that it was a horribly injured bear, maybe hit by a truck or train, and somehow still alive in its final moments. Its limbs didn't make sense. Half its face was gone. Everything about it was wrong. I told my family, but they said I must have been dreaming or hallucinating. No one believed me. Sometimes I don't even believe myself, but I know I wasn't dreaming. My shoes were still covered in dirt from running home. I don't believe in God or fate, but I know what I saw was real. I've never gone on a late night walk since. Whatever that thing was, it was an abomination waiting to die. Story 3. When I traveled to India about 20 years ago, I took a bus or coach to get from one city to another. It was a night bus, so I slept through most of the ride. It was dark, and the road was surrounded by forest. The only light came from the bus headlights, and we seemed completely alone. I woke up for a brief moment and stared out the window. That's when I saw a creature on the side of the road hurrying into the dark woods. The moment only lasted a second or two, but I saw it very clearly. It looked like something with a human body moving in an inverted crab walk. It had the head of a Doberman or a jackal and a waddling gait. Each limb moved independently, almost like an insect. Everyone around me was asleep, and I felt like a crazy person. I kept telling myself that I must have seen something else and misinterpreted it, since it was only a glimpse. Over the years, I've even questioned whether I dreamed it. I feel extremely certain about what I saw, but I'm probably wrong. There is likely a logical explanation. A few years ago, I stumbled across a GIF. It isn't real, but what I saw looked almost exactly like that creature, maybe with a more jackal-like head. I'm a very rational person, and don't believe in supernatural things. But being in an Indian forest at night will make even the most sane person doubt their mind. Those forests are truly scary. Edit. I'm getting a lot of questions about hypnagogic, hallucinations, and sleep paralysis. I worded myself poorly. I only mentioned sleep to point out that everyone else was sleeping. I should have specified that I was completely awake when I saw it. While I feel knowledgeable enough about paralysis and hallucinations to mostly rule them out, I won't dismiss them entirely. What this incident really did was instill a childlike fear and irrationality in me. The thing looked so unnatural. It was fear of the unknown and inexplicable. I think about this incident often, since it's the only supernatural encounter I've ever had. Later, while in medical school, I learned about genu recurvatum. It's possible that what I saw was a human or animal with a deformity rather than something supernatural. Realizing that gave me a different kind of fear. One is the idea that a deformed human could be roaming the jungle at night, far from civilization. The other, and perhaps worse, is the realization that we as humans are willing to push people out of society because of stigma. It's frightening to think someone born like that might end up living in the forest instead of being treated with dignity. Or maybe I met a frigging alien. Who knows? Story 4. Back in 2017, on the 3rd of February, my friend and I took my dog for a walk through the park and into the woods. It was the day after his 20th birthday, and 2 days after mine. When we reached the railway bridge, it was absolutely pouring with rain, to the point that my friend suggested we turn back. I loved the woods, even in the rain, and insisted we keep going. I figured the trees would shelter us once we were inside, and we'd stay mostly dry. So we continued on. My friend walked a few steps ahead of me, his hood pulled tight. A couple of minutes after entering the woods, we came across what looked like another walker standing to the side of the path, as if giving us room to pass. As I turned to thank him, I realized it wasn't someone out for a walk at all, but a man hanging from a tree. After one blood-curdling scream and a frantic call to the police, I went home and sobbed into my dad's shoulder, then my mom's, and finally took a long bath. The look on his face is still clear in my mind, and I haven't really been back there many times since. Story 5. I had a friend who told me a story once. He didn't like to talk about it because it still creeped him out. He told me this story about 12 years ago, and it had happened 2 or 3 years before that. Anyway, he was out riding four-wheelers at the St. Anthony Sand Dunes in Idaho one weekend. As they were riding, they saw a tree off in the distance on a hill, a lone tree with sand all around it. At one point, they noticed what looked like a man dressed all in black, almost like he was wearing a gorilla suit, but it was hard to tell because he was too far away. He was standing next to the tree, holding on to one of the low-hanging branches and watching them. They didn't think much of it at first, though it seemed strange to see someone out there all by himself. Eventually, they drove over to that area. By then, the man was gone, but as they got closer to the tree, they realized it was much larger than they initially thought. The lowest hanging branch was a good 10 feet off the ground, and it had lined up with the figure's shoulder, which would have made him absolutely huge. They never knew who or what they saw. Maybe it was Bigfoot, or maybe it was something else entirely. He never talked about it again. Story 6. I remember going off-roading with a friend in a very remote wooded area. A lot of people around there know the spot, and once you've driven it with someone who knows the way, it's pretty straightforward. There's one section of the dirt road where 2 roads merge into one. Going in, it isn't a big deal, but on the way out, we couldn't remember which road we had come from. Both of our phones were completely dead. We decided to go right and see if anything looked familiar, which was difficult since it was just trees for miles with no clear landmarks. Eventually, we came across a pond, which immediately told us we had chosen the wrong road. I was relieved that we finally knew, but frustrated that we had driven about 30 minutes in the wrong direction. By then, it was dark, and we couldn't drive fast because we didn't want to miss the split on the way back. After a bit of driving, I saw what looked like a small animal on the side of the road, just outside the tree line. As we got closer, a cold sweat washed over me when I realized it was actually a large man crouching there with a machete. My friend panicked and hit the gas, speeding past him. The man didn't move from his crouch position. He just slowly turned his head and followed the truck with his eyes. I have no idea whether he was hunting or had something else in mind, but it scared the hell out of me. Story 7. I used to be a tour guide at a world-famous haunted mansion. Between tours, the guides had to walk through the mansion to dust and sweep. It could feel a little eerie walking alone through an old, supposedly haunted Victorian mansion, but I didn't believe in ghosts, so it never bothered me much. The long-deceased owner was known as an eccentric old woman who had stood at about 4 feet 10 inches. One day, I was in the middle of the mansion, sweeping at the bottom of a staircase. No one else was around when I suddenly heard a tiny voice say, "Excuse me." Startled, I looked up toward the top of the staircase and was even more shocked by what I saw. Standing there was an old woman in a flower print dress, about 4 feet 10 inches tall. My legs went weak, and I think I actually dropped my broom. I tried to speak, but I was so scared that no words came out. After a moment of me standing there shaking in silence, she spoke again. "I lost my tour group. Can you help me find them? I never told the other tour guides that I nearly scared myself to death because I had mistaken a lost old woman from a tour group for a ghost." Story 8. Last summer, a friend and I went on a hike near his house. A few minutes down the trail, we stopped when we saw a deer standing in the middle of the path, eating and paying no attention to us. Shortly after noticing the deer, we saw a large shadow in the background. We only noticed it because it seemed to be changing. At first, it looked like a huge figure, something we thought might be a bear. It was closer to the deer than we were, which made it strange that the deer wasn't reacting. The shadow then appeared to get shorter while keeping the same width, and then it split into 2 shadows. We stood there, confused, watching without moving. We thought it might be a bear and her cub, and that we were only just noticing the second one. Then the deer finally got spooked, and the shadows kept changing, each one growing taller. At that point, we realized how much they were shifting, and it wasn't just our imagination because we both saw it happening. The shadows became taller and more slender, almost resembling people. I started waving my hand as obviously as I could, and I swear one of the shadows, the one opposite me, copied the movement. I turned around, decided I was done, and went straight back to my friend's house. We played video games for the rest of the night. Story 9. My husband and I were driving my sister-in-law home one early evening. This was a well-populated, well-used road in the center of town. As we passed a church, I saw what I can only describe as a huge black dog appear in the middle of the road. It ran toward the church and reached a fence. Then its dog-like legs stretched out like arms as it crawled through the wooden slats, its back legs pulling through the way a human would. My husband looked at me and said, "So, you saw that, right?" It spooked him badly, especially since he doesn't believe in the paranormal. Later, I talked to my husband again because my memory can be fuzzy. He reminded me that we were talking to each other while the thing was running across the street, saying things like, "You seeing that?" He also jogged my memory. The dog materialized in the left lane next to us, right in the middle of the road, in what looked like a puff of smoke. It ran in front of our car, and when it reached the church fence, its legs shifted from bending low like a dog's to an elongated human-like bend. It was about 100 feet in front of us. My husband remembers it climbing over the fence, while I remember it going under the top rail. Either way, it remains the single creepiest encounter we've ever had. Story 10. I was about 15 years old and spending the summer in Costa Rica, where I have a lot of family. Most of them lived in the city, but we also had a house deep in the countryside, a few kilometers outside a tiny town called San Pedro. It was mountainous, surrounded by thick jungle forest. A very serene place, really. The house was small and old, with some handmade pools and decks farther up the hill. There was power and running water, enough for a relaxing getaway. It sat high in the mountains, surrounded by jungle, with some scattered ranch land and farmland nearby. It was honestly one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. But because of how isolated it was, it could feel a little creepy, especially after dark. Sometimes you'd see lights in the forest where there shouldn't have been any, and occasionally strange things in the sky. Under the tree canopy, it got dark quickly, and all kinds of animals would come out and make noise. Noise in the jungle at night is normal, but one particular night was different. It was just me, my abuela, my tia, my tio, and my cousin. We were all in bed reading, since there was no internet, and smartphones were still new. That night was almost completely silent, which in itself felt strange. Suddenly, a scream shattered the quiet. It wasn't just any scream. It sounded partly human and was absolutely blood-curdling, like a woman mixed with a cat. It was vile and terrifying. It started right outside the house and moved quickly up toward the pool area, still incredibly loud. As it moved, there was a thunderous sound, like a dozen horses galloping alongside whatever was screaming. It went past the pool, across a field, and all the way toward the river. The whole thing lasted about a minute, but it felt much longer. We were all badly shaken. My cousin, who was about 10, couldn't fall back asleep that night. Strangely, once it was over, the jungle returned to normal, with insects chittering and the usual nighttime sounds. The next morning, we went out to look and found tons of hoof prints. A local farmer said his horses had escaped, but that didn't explain the screaming. My abuela told me it must have been La Bruja, a witch. People out there believe in such legends, elves, fairies, and other things. In remote jungle countryside, who knows what might be out there? Anyway, that's my story. Story 11. My mother, her boyfriend, and I were coming back from somewhere and decided to stop at Harrison Lake, which is beautiful. I'm grateful for my intuition because I decided I didn't want to go swimming, even though my mom was planning to go in by herself. Just as she was about to enter the water, we noticed a large crowd of people all gathered together at one part of the lake. The problem with this lake is that it has a sudden, steep drop-off that is known to be dangerous. However, local authorities don't put up warning signs because they worry it would harm businesses around the lake. It turned out there was a large family gathering, and several people had been out on the water playing. 2 of them went missing, and everyone was standing there waiting for authorities to report back on what they found. We watched 2 boats searching the water, but later learned they weren't official authorities at all, just volunteers. When we tried to look it up afterward, we found countless other stories about this lake, many of them ending with someone dead. I'm thankful my mother and I realized what was happening when we did. Story 12. This happened in the small town of Gentryville, Indiana, a place with a population of about 260 people. Before I go on, I should say that I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or creatures. I've always felt that people are scary enough on their own. That night really challenged my beliefs. A friend invited me on a camping trip, and I happily agreed since I jump at any opportunity to camp. I got directions and drove out to Gentryville. We ended up camping just off the main road, a short distance behind a small, white, generic church. The day was normal enough. We built a fire and had a few drinks. Later into the night, nature called. I told my friends I was heading up the road to pee. I walked a bit down the dirt road to get some privacy. The spot I chose let me still see the fire and my friends, but it was darker. The moon was very bright that night, casting soft light on the trees. That's when I saw it, standing no more than 12 feet from me. The best comparison I can make is a gray alien. I know how that sounds, but that's what it was. It wasn't the cliche gray you see in movies. It was over 6 feet tall and wore something metallic, transparent, or reflective that hung straight and pressed flat. It stood completely still, blending almost perfectly into the tree line. The only thing that moved was its face, which made aggressive, disapproving expressions once it noticed me. Its face was gray and wrinkled, especially around the eyes and mouth. The mouth angled downward into a small opening. The eyes were large and slightly sunken. It made no sound. We just stared at each other, and I was frozen in fear. Then, just as suddenly, the fear vanished. I finished up, turned my back to it, and walked away. The walk back felt calm, but as soon as I sat down by the fire, the fear rushed back. It was like the encounter had been temporarily erased and then returned all at once. I told my friend who lived in the area that I had seen something up the road and that it scared me. I kept the details vague so I wouldn't sound crazy, saying only that I thought someone was in the tree line. Without hesitation, he asked, "Was it gray?" My stomach dropped. I said yes and asked why he would ask that. He told me that one night, while working in his driveway near the woods, one had charged at him and tried to attack before fleeing back into the trees. I will never forget the range of feelings that went through my head while locked in its stare. That experience has left me uneasy about camping or being alone in the woods. Story 13. A few years ago, when I was unhoused, I slept wherever I could. I have plenty of stories from that time, but this is one that still sticks with me. One night, I was sleeping in a heavily forested inner city park with my significant other. We had just finished banging when we noticed a man in a hoodie standing about 20 feet away. I asked him what he wanted, but he didn't respond and just stared at us in silence. It was around 2 in the morning, and the whole situation felt threatening and ominous. At that point in my life, I always slept with a knife under my makeshift pillow, for good reason. I discreetly grabbed it and kept asking him what he wanted, telling him to leave. After a few minutes, he silently walked about 100 yards away and sat under a tree. As strange as it sounds, that was enough for us to fall back asleep. The next night, I was in the same park by myself. I had just smoked, which I rarely did back then, and I was listening to black metal through my headphones when I suddenly got the feeling that I was being watched. I looked up and saw the same hooded man, again, about 20 feet away. This time, I grabbed my knife immediately, jumped to my feet, and demanded to know what he wanted. He stayed completely silent and still for what felt like a very long time. Then, suddenly, he started walking toward me. I was fully prepared for this to be life or death. I'm not saying that to sound tough. It genuinely felt that serious. I was holding a knife. So either he was extremely confident or completely unhinged. After a few steps toward me, he stopped, stared again, then turned around and walked out of the park. I was so shaken that I broke down and cried almost immediately. I never once saw his face. He was just a black-clad figure who behaved nothing like any person I'd ever encountered. It was deeply unsettling. I hated it. I'm housed now, and I still won't go anywhere near that park. Being homeless really does suck. Story 14. My husband convinced me to go camping for the first time as an adult. I have a very vivid imagination. That night, after we went to bed, I was wide awake. Suddenly, I heard an unidentifiable sound, almost like a horn blowing, which made no sense since we were out in the woods. I wasn't sure if it was real at first, but then I heard it again. I woke my husband so he could listen, but he said he didn't hear anything and fell back asleep. The sound came and went all night. At one point, it sounded like it was about 100 yards away. Every time I tried to wake my husband, he insisted he didn't hear it. I started to convince myself it was aliens and that they were coming to get me, and only me. It turned out the sound was just a group of elk bugling throughout the night. It scared the hell out of me though. Story 15. Not super creepy, but when I lived in Florida, there was a small patch of woods that stretched out behind our house and the neighbors' houses. I used to play back there a lot as a little kid and would go exploring. I found an abandoned treehouse far enough back that my parents couldn't see me, but close enough that I could still see through the patio door. I would dig around and find treasures, ranging from clothes and shoes to a car battery, nail polish, and a few hammers. I liked it back there for a while, until I started to feel like I was being watched. I finally stopped playing there when I found a newer-looking baseball bat, a few empty bottles of those little Jack Daniels, and lots of syringes. Sometimes I think about what kind of Florida man headline I could have ended up in. Story 16. I live in the woods. Tiny house, no neighbors, My property backs up to a creek and more than 100 acres of open land. At night, it's super quiet. I always hear strange noises, and I'm used to it by now. No big deal. One night, I heard something that sounded like screaming. I figured it was probably coyotes. The noise got quieter and quieter throughout the night. Again, no big deal. The only thing was that my German Shepherd was acting extremely strange, really weird. He stayed glued to my side, which is not like him at all. I thought about going out with a spotlight to investigate, but my Shepherd's behavior changed my mind. I went to bed and he stayed awake all night. He lay by the front door and just stared. The next day in the light, I went out to investigate. Past the creek, there's a high rock ridge. My Shepherd went straight to the edge. I walked up, looked down, and there was a body. Apparently, he had tried to off himself and thought it was a far enough drop. The noises during the night were from after he jumped and realized the distance wasn't enough to kill him, only to injure him horribly. Story 17. I was walking in Richmond Park in London, which is rather famous for its deer. I went for a walk on what I thought was a fairly well-used path. Well, it would have been a well-used path in most woodlands, but Richmond Park, being one of the main parks in London, clearly has designated paths for most visitors. I started going up the hill along this path, thinking it would be a through route to another path I wanted to reach. Along the way, I noticed some deer tracks. If I had realized just how fresh they were, I might have turned back. While roe deer are generally manageable, the deer in Richmond Park are a different story, particularly during rutting season. This was not rutting season. I went up the path, happy as Larry, when I turned a corner and passed a big tree. Just as I emerged from behind it, only a few yards away and further up the hill, stood a massive red deer stag in its prime, staring at me as if to say, "What do you think you're doing here?" Naturally, I was very surprised. If I had encountered a deer, I would have expected at least a female, possibly bounding away in front of me. But to be faced with a potentially aggressive red deer stag standing imposingly above me was frankly terrifying, especially alone. The first thing I did after processing what was happening was to turn around and very slowly walk back down the hill toward the main path. Luckily, the stag didn't follow me. In retrospect, I honestly don't think he expected a person there, hence the surprised look. He probably wasn't a serious threat, but they are big, potentially dangerous animals when in a bad mood. Story 18. Not really creepy, but it definitely scared me. When I was in high school, I was camping with my girlfriend, her best friend, and her boyfriend. It was at a local campground. Nothing too clandestine. We were just being high school seniors, drinking, smoking, and having a good time. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, men with M500 Mossbergs, M4s, and pistols drawn walked through our campsite. They looked at us, a finger over their lips, signaling us to be quiet. We then witnessed an FBI and ATF raid on the campsite directly across from ours. They came back afterward and did some routine questioning about the men they were arresting. It turned out it was a drug bust on a group of airmen. Afterward, they left, and we continued our drinking and smoking. Story 19. I genuinely thought I was going to die when we went on vacation to Destin when I was younger. We were on a dolphin-watching glass-bottom boat ride when I saw a huge dark mass under the boat. It kept getting bigger and bigger, and I started panicking because, well, a big prehistoric shark swallowing the whole boat was my oddly specific biggest fear. I completely freaked out my grandparents when I started screaming and crying about being eaten by a meg, which was impossible due to the depth of the water and the fact that they are extinct. They ended up taking me to a psychiatrist that summer, and shortly after, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia. It turns out I really did see a meg and wasn't just playing a stupid prank. It just wasn't actually there. That's the story of how I faced my worst fear at the time and found out I got the crazy gene. Story 20. The creepiest thing I've seen was on a Jeep trail up one of the Mount Charleston trails. It was winter, and there was a lot of snow up there. We came to a section of trail where all of the trees and bushes looked like they had exploded. Not logged, not cut down, simply exploded. The stumps were jagged, about 2 to 4 feet high, and tree debris was scattered everywhere. It looked like a war zone, roughly 50 yards long and 20 feet wide. I never figured out what caused it or why. I thought I had photos for proof, but I guess I didn't take any because of the sheer awe of the moment. Story 21. My sister and I were visiting our aunt in Syracuse, Utah, when we passed a farm or ranch in the middle of the desert. It was about 11:30 at night. I suddenly got a horrible feeling in my stomach, and I'm still not sure what compelled me, but I screamed, "Turn this damn car around!" It felt like something bad was going to happen if we didn't get out of there. There was a smell of rot, like a dead animal. I also remember tasting strong metal in my mouth. Realistically, it was probably blood from biting my tongue, but I don't remember my tongue bleeding. She pulled over to the side of the road. I remember clearly that a deer-looking thing jumped onto the hood of the car and then jumped off a moment later. It wasn't a deer, because it was wearing some kind of clothing on its lower half. I didn't get a good look at the top half, but it wasn't human, and it definitely wasn't a deer. It left 2 fairly large dents in the hood. How often do deer jump onto the hoods of cars? And how many deer are even in the Utah desert? I can't explain what it was, but my uncle is a deeply spiritual Navajo man, and he believes it was a skinwalker, and that we are now marked for death. I'm not sure how much I believe, but he is adamant. Story 22. 2 very creepy things happened to me in the same stretch of woods, about half a mile apart. A few weeks ago, a buddy and I heard about a private man-made lake you could bike to. We parked at a school, walked through the woods around a huge gate, and then biked about a mile down a dirt path. When we reached the lake, I saw, out of the corner of my eye, a tree limb about the size of a car hit the ground roughly 300 feet away. I stared at the tree line where it fell, and then watched 2 pine trees start shaking violently, almost as if they were twigs. Fear rushed through my body as I watched this go on for about 30 seconds. When I was finally able to speak, I started telling my friend what I had seen. As I was explaining it, we heard something that sounded like a plane engine starting on the other side of the lake. The noise then shifted into a violent roar that sent chills down my spine. My friend looked at me, and we both decided to get the hell out of there. The second incident happened about a week ago on a different dirt road not far from that area. Some friends and I were walking down the road around 11 at night. About a quarter mile in, we found 2 coolers. One was filled with old books dating back to slave-era years. The other cooler was closed and had "Severed Head Inside" written on it, with a skull drawn on the lid. We opened it, but it was only filled with water. We were thoroughly creeped out and decided to jog back. As we did, we heard loud metal banging sounds and what sounded like humans trying to mimic animals. At that point, our jog turned into a full sprint. This probably sounds stupid, but we're planning a camping trip in those woods soon, so wish us luck. Story 23. In Britain, we do something called Daof-E. Basically, you do volunteering and skill work, and at the end, you do an expedition where you have to get from one place to another using a map and camping. When I was 14, doing my bronze Daof-E, my group walked through an area with thick bushes very hidden away. We passed a car with 3 men nearby. One wore a suit, one wore a tracksuit, and the third, a big man in a white vest and blue trousers, looked like a classic henchman. The suit and tracksuit men were by the boot of the car talking, while the big man dug a hole behind the car, out of view. As we walked past, all 3 suddenly stopped. The man in the suit slammed the boot shut, and the man in the vest stopped digging. All of them looked menacing, and the man in the vest said, "Get the hell out now, or I'll make you." We left immediately. I've always wondered what shady activity they were involved in, but I was too scared to go back and find out. Story 24. Years ago, I was walking with a friend through a dark spot on a local back road. The road dipped down a hill into very thick woods, passing through a lightless valley, before climbing again toward a streetlight on the far side. As we approached the valley, I started to get a very odd, uncomfortable feeling about that darkened patch. We had been this way many times before, and nothing had ever bothered us there. I am not afraid of the dark in general. There was no obvious reason for the feeling, but it was like a coldness washed over me, a certainty that something terrible was moments away. There was a sense of being watched that seemed to come from the woods. I slowed as we approached the Valley of Shadow, and the feeling did not go away. I said, and my friend, who was a ways ahead of me, turned around quizzically. As he did, there was a sudden, low, barrel-chested growl from the woods to his right. It sounded like something huge and canid, something the size of a small bear. My friend went white and started mall-walking back up the hill toward me. I backed away too, with both a sinking feeling in my gut that I had been right, and a vague, disquieting shock that I had somehow received a warning. We turned around and walked another way. We used that part of the road again frequently on our evening walks, but never encountered anything like it again. Story 25, about 2 years ago, I was making a long drive from Nebraska back home toward Illinois. This happened somewhere in an unpopulated Siberia of rural nowhere, maybe Kansas. I did not have the money for a hotel at the time and needed to rest, so I pulled off the road down a little gravel path that eventually led to a cattle gate at the edge of a field. I stopped in front of the gate and shut the car off. Around me was almost perfect darkness. The only lights were distant sodium lamps, blue and white pinpricks on the horizon. As the engine died, I suddenly realized I was hearing something, lowing. I was hearing a large group of animals, lowing and bleating in what sounded like terrible pain. I was near a dark field that sloped down toward a stand of trees, and it seemed to be coming from there. I heard a cow, something that sounded like a goat, the high-pitched screeching of a pig, and, dear God, a man. There was a man there too, screaming full-throated right along with the animals. It sounded like something straight out of hell, and the man did not sound like he was pretending. That was a full-on, I am going to die scream, and he just kept doing it. I sat there for maybe too long, making absolutely certain of what I was hearing. I never thought to take out my phone. I am too old to do it instinctively, and it never crossed my mind. I had chills running down my back and did not dare breathe until I was sure. There was no light down there at all, and no sign of anyone, just that unholy cacophony. At least 3 barnyard animals and a man, all screaming as if they were being murdered on the spot. I hate to say that I left, but that is exactly what I did. There was no light, no clear way down, and no way in hell I was walking through a dark field in the middle of the night to find out what was happening. I turned the engine over, put the car in reverse, and got out of there. I have seen some things, too many of them. Story 26. I am an avid hunter, and I never hunt alone because of one situation that still gives me chills. I was hunting in Northern California on a private ranch owned by a friend of a friend. He was supposed to go with me, but did not, for whatever reason. I cannot remember now. All in all, it was a typical afternoon, sunny and pleasant. The land was somewhat maintained, with decent dirt roads running all over the ranch, though I was walking most of it. Close to sunset, I had not seen a thing and decided to pack it in. As I walked back toward my car, I noticed tracks beside mine that had not been there before. Huge paw prints, a mountain lion, were following my exact path for at least half a mile. When it finally hit me, I felt sick and kept my gun at the ready the rest of the way back. I realize now that if it had wanted to, I would have been deader than dead. I do not know why it only stalked me for a while. Even now, thinking about it still makes me uneasy. There is a reason for the buddy system. Story 27. This did not happen to me, but I once spoke with an older gentleman who was a big game hunter. He had gone out to Wyoming with a group of friends, though I do not remember what they were hunting. They set up a plan to start at a specific spot and walk parallel at different angles, about half a mile apart, so that if something happened, they could send out a warning signal for help. He had been walking for a couple of miles and was only seeing small animals when he reached a point where he was no longer hearing anything. No birds, no scurrying animals. Nothing at all. He said it felt unreal. It had never been that quiet before, and it gave him goosebumps. Finally, he heard a noise behind him, and did not even have time to fully turn his head before he saw a grizzly bear charging at him at full speed. He was mauled. Luckily, one of his friends was behind him and was able to shoot the bear. He was only seconds away from dying in those woods, but he survived. The creepiest part was learning that his friend had watched the grizzly stalk him for miles and had been unable to do anything until the attack. It was a stark reminder of how small the difference can be between prey and predator in places like that. Story 28. I was 19 years old, helping clear out 3 properties on a 350-acre farm owned by a recently deceased 98-year-old man who had lived there his entire life. We had already heard stories about supposed illegitimate family members fighting over everything. We were there with 3 maximum-sized dumpster roll-offs and equipment to literally gut the place and throw everything out before the property sale. In a single day, we found 13 hidden firearms. They were everywhere you could imagine. Under couches, taped to the backs of fridges and freezers, inside bookshelves, and even a partially broken down pistol sitting in a toilet cistern, rusting there for what was probably decades. The creepy part came while clearing out one of the property's one-bomb standalone barns. We had to use a tractor to reach the top shelf. OSHA was definitely not kept in mind. While grabbing items from above, a brown box fell to the ground, and a human jawbone rolled out. At first, I asked my friend if it could be an animal jaw. When we opened the box, it was obvious it was not. Inside was the rest of the skull, sitting on top of about 200 pieces of old-time paper. There was a brown stain in the middle of the stack that faded as it reached the bottom. We called the local small-town police. They sent 2 patrol cars and a coroner. After about 2 weeks of pestering them about whether they were going to open a case, they told us their conclusion. The man had received his doctor's license sometime in the 1930s, so they were calling it a medical specimen. A medical specimen sitting in a standalone barn on 350 acres in the middle of nowhere, inside a cardboard box, on top of old parchment paper, with a drip pattern. Stain running from the top of the stack to the bottom. The reality was that they did not want to spend resources chasing what very likely could have been a murder, especially since the owner was dead and the property was about to be gone. Story 29. There is an abandoned house on my street. Actually several, but this one is shrouded in mystery. Even longtime neighbors are clueless. The house has remained as it was 9 years ago, when the woman left for shopping. This is obvious from the car in the driveway, still filled with Walmart sacks. Her coat and a blanket sit in the seat, gloves on the console, and the key is in the ignition. And that is it. Poof, gone. I have called the property tax department to find clues, and they are just as clueless as anyone. I have been inside, and while I said it looked as it did the day she left, it has since become a wildlife haven. Still, the fridge is full, dishes remain in the dishwasher, and clothes sit in the washer. Someone pays the property taxes at the end of every year, but always 6 months late. Story 30. A group of friends and I were drunk, and it was 2 a.m. when we went to the grocery store. A sober friend, who does not drink for religious reasons, drove us. Everything seemed fine, but as we browsed the store, I kept thinking I saw something out of the corner of my eye. When we got back to the parking lot and into the car, another vehicle's headlights suddenly turned on. In my head, it felt like a beacon for a serial killer. I brushed it off at first as paranoia. Then the vehicle pulled out of the lot behind us and went the same direction we did. The driver said she thought the car was stalking us too, so she sped up until she lost sight of it, turned off the headlights, and drove down an unlit dirt road we were familiar with. We waited there and watched as the vehicle made a U-turn, pulled into a nearby housing complex parking lot, then turned around and left. The next day, I received a private message on social media from a fake, anonymous account. It said how happy he was to have seen me at the grocery store with my friends and that I looked sexy in the purple dress. I about shat a brick. Story 31. I am in a power wheelchair. I cannot stand up, much less walk. Several years ago, my family and I took a vacation to Washington, D.C. The wheelchair I had at the time was a piece of junk and would not hold a charge long enough to last a full day. So almost every night my wife and kids ended up pushing me in the chair back to the hotel. Knowing this, we planned to visit one of the sites at night, the Lincoln Memorial, I think. That afternoon, we stayed at the hotel with my chair plugged in, trying to get as much charge as possible so we might make the trip without exhausting everyone. We saw the sights and then headed back to the subway, or metro, or whatever it is called, only to learn that certain stops, including the one nearest our hotel, closed at a specific time at night. We were well past that time, so we found the nearest open stop and decided to get off there and hope for the best. When the train stopped, the cars and the platform at that station did not line up quite right. There was a gap of about 4 to 6 inches, along with a step up of a couple of inches. My chair, being as bad as it was, would not make that gap going forward, so I turned around to try it backward. I am not sure how it happened, but the rear casters of my chair turned sideways and dropped into the gap between the train and the platform. I was completely stuck and could not move. Suddenly, my chair began to rock violently back and forth, tossing me around pretty roughly. Thinking it was my wife, I started to turn to tell her to ease up, because she was about to beat me to death. As I turned my head, I saw my wife and all 4 of my kids standing a few feet away, staring at me in horror. Now, genuinely scared, I turned back and saw a homeless man with both hands on my chair, shaking it with everything he had. I started to say something, but just as my mouth opened, he managed to pull my chair out of the gap and onto the platform. I was so surprised that I just stared for a moment. He did not say a word. He simply turned and drunkenly shambled away. When reality finally caught up with me, I called out, "Thank you." He did not answer or even turn around. He only raised a hand to acknowledge it and disappeared into the night. He nearly broke my ribs, slamming me into the arms of my chair, but he got me out of there. We still joke about the drunk guardian angel of Washington, D.C. Story 32. I had just started seeing a girl I met online. We had been on a few dates and had talked about how much we loved urban exploration. We looked up a few places online that might interest us, and the one that stood out was, of course, an abandoned psychiatric asylum. I know, it sounds cliche. It was about 30 minutes from where I lived, so we decided to check it out. The place was fenced and had guards patrolling regularly, probably to prevent vandalism. Some people who had visited before left instructions online for anyone else who wanted to see it, so I knew where to park and which fence to sneak through. We got there and made our way through the grounds. It had clearly been very prestigious at one time, with grand entrances, stone archways, and statues. Again, very cliche, but it was creepy. Even in daylight, the place was seriously overgrown. We finally reached the old building, completely run down, with metal sheets covering the windows. At the top, there was a tower with a grand circular design, and you could see the metal staircase inside through the windows. For some reason, these particular windows were not boarded up, like the ones on the ground level. We stood at the perimeter fence looking up when I saw them. I swear there were 3 faces peering at us through the circular design at the top of the tower. They were laughing, jumping up and down, with huge piercing eyes. We could hear the clang, clang, clang of the metal staircase under their feet as they moved. It was like they were excited to see us. Their faces disappeared, but the clang, clang, clang continued. Then it hit me. They were running down the metal staircase. At points, we saw them pass a window as the staircase echoed through the building. It all happened so fast, but the sense of danger was overwhelming. The adrenaline I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I grabbed my date's hand and we ran. We got back to the car and drove off in a hurry. It was probably just a bunch of teens messing with us, but their faces were so sinister. Now, thinking back, I wonder how they even got inside. We had walked around the perimeter before we saw them, and there was no clear way in or out. Every doorway and window was boarded up. Whoever they were, they scared the life out of us. Safe to say, our days of urban exploration were over. Story 33. When I was around 10 years old, I visited my aunt and uncle's dairy farm during the school holidays. I helped herd cattle on motorbikes and took care of general chores around the property. It was a good time in my life. One cold, dreary day, my cousin and I decided to stay inside and watch movies. After a while, my cousin went to take a nap, leaving me alone to keep watching. The room had massive glass doors covered by thick curtains to block out the sun and make the movie easier to see. At one end of the curtains, there was a small gap where they did not quite meet. Out of nowhere, I got the strange feeling that I was being watched. I looked over and, for a split second, saw the edge of a man's face. Like any 10-year-old would, I panicked and pulled a blanket over my head. When I looked again, he was gone. I woke my cousin, and we went around locking all the doors and windows. When my aunt and uncle got home, we told them what I had seen, but they were hesitant to believe me, since the property was far from town. The next day, my uncle went outside and found one of their work dogs hanging from a rope on my cousin's swing set. Someone had killed the dog. My aunt and uncle asked me to describe the man, and all I could remember was that he had red hair and looked dirty. They called the police, but with so little evidence, nothing could be done. The officers took a report and left. A few days later, my older cousin was cleaning out a garage separate from the house. The garage had a closed-in loft that was rarely used except for storage. Inside, my cousin found old clothes, bedding, and food wrappers. Someone had been squatting there. Once again, my family reported it to the police. No one was ever held responsible for the dog, and they never found the red-haired man who had been living in the garage. It remains one of the freakiest encounters I have ever had. Story 34. I was traveling through the Taurus Mountains with my family on the way to our home village. It was late at night, and everyone except my dad was asleep. The area is filled with canyons and caves, some with holes as deep as 1.4 kilometers. As we came around a curve, headlights suddenly caught several pairs of reflecting eyes, 3, maybe 4 or more, staring directly at me. It looked like a pack of wolves tearing apart a dead goat or sheep. My dad does not remember seeing anything like that, and I think it may have been my imagination. Still, I had the spookiest dreams and feelings during that visit to the village. I have never had experiences like that before or since. I visit the village every year, and this only happened once. I even woke up from my most frightening dream to find my glasses broken on the table. I have never talked about this with anyone until now. Story 35. I did not see anything, but I was camping in the Mojave Desert, and it was probably 2 a.m. I was alone in my tent when I started hearing what sounded like a baby screaming and crying. I was in the middle of nowhere, having hiked about 5 miles to reach my campsite. I sat upright in my tent, grabbed my gun, and listened. The screaming and crying seemed to be getting louder, and I was just about to get out of my tent to see what was making the sound when I heard the coyotes. They were all around my tent, screaming like women. I stayed as still as I possibly could until everything finally stopped. Afterward, I nearly threw up from the stress. Later, I talked to a friend who frequently camped in the same area, and he told me they had likely killed a rabbit, and that the baby-like crying was a distress call from the rabbit. Either way, when you are alone in the desert at 2 a.m., and start hearing something like that, it turns the blood in your veins to ice. Story 36. I was out in the wilderness with some friends once when it began to snow heavily, thanks to an unpredictable British winter. There were 8 of us in the group, all wearing big coats with our faces mostly hidden. We decided to head back to our transport, not wanting to stay out any longer. As we were walking, I suddenly heard a commotion and shouting behind me. I turned to see one of my friends wearing a green coat, sprinting off into the snow. After a collective moment of confusion from half the group, we realized what had happened. One of the girls had started talking to the guy in the green coat, only to quickly realize he was a complete stranger. He had been silently walking with us, hanging around our campsite and following us for hours without anyone noticing. He was about twice our age. We never saw him again. Story 37. One night, I decided to walk home from a late appointment by taking a nature trail through the woods. I had run there in the evenings before, and while I occasionally saw someone, it had always seemed pretty safe. Part of the walk took me past a community center that was fairly well lit, with a path leading up into the surrounding neighborhood. As I came out of the trees in that area, I suddenly noticed a man standing silently beside the trail. He was completely nondescript. Brown hair, jeans, and a short jacket. As I walked past him, leaving as much space as I could, I looked at him and smiled politely. He stared back at me, unblinking, and then said loudly, "Don't look into my eyes." After that, he made some kind of unearthly growling sound in his throat. I looked away as fast as I could and kept walking, trying to keep him in my peripheral vision. Thinking he might be moving toward me, I glanced back at him again. "Don't look at me," he yelled in the same unsettling voice. I completely lost it and ran for the sidewalk leading back into the neighborhood, sprinting up a steep hill as fast as I could. I did not stop running once I left the trees, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the man. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way home, and was very glad when I moved a few weeks later. It was probably just an addict, but I was terrified. Story 38. When I was about 18, I was driving roughly 5 miles east of a tiny rural town in Washington called Kittitas. I was alone, driving a Honda Ridgeline that was not mine, just looking for a cool spot on top of a hill to overlook the valley and smoke weed. Long after the asphalt turned into dirt roads, I passed a miserable-looking piece of land with a large, industrial shed-like structure on it. I saw a truck there, but assumed nobody actually lived on the property. I drove past slowly, maybe around 30 miles per hour, since weed was still illegal in Washington at the time, and driving high still is. I was trying to keep a low profile. As I headed up a massive hill on a rocky dirt road, I noticed about halfway up that the same truck from that property was behind me, tailing me up the bumpy road. I was pretty weirded out, but also fairly confident the guy did not own the hill. At the top, he sped past me in his truck, cut me off, and I slammed on the brakes. He got out of his truck while I barely cracked my window and kept the engine running. He started screaming nonsense about how I had been going 60 miles per hour past his place and could have run his kids over. I had seen no signs of children, but whatever. I apologized and said I was just cruising around. He asked if I was high. I said no. Then he asked if I wanted to get high. I said no. Then he asked if I had a gun. I said no again. He responded with something like, "Yeah, you never know who has a gun these days, do you?" I said nothing and just stared at him. Then he told me to lower the window or he would break it. The calm way he said it completely freaked me out. Then one of the top 5 most reckless things I have ever done happened. I told him to F off, threw the truck into reverse, and peeled out, kicking dust and rocks his way. He sprinted back to his truck, and I thought he was grabbing a gun, but instead he jumped in and chased me for a short distance before giving up. I was shaking, but once I got away, I started cheering and yelling like an idiot. I must have been doing around 50 miles per hour down that rough road, completely panicked. Probably just a crazy redneck trying to scare me. My buddy and I went back the next week like the idiots we were, and held the horn down while speeding past his place. Good times. Story 39. This was the first time I ever went hiking or camping alone. I was in a remote area of the high desert and was already pretty scared to be out there by myself. It was just me, a bunch of juniper trees, and freezing gray skies. I kept psyching myself up, but I could not shake the feeling that something was nearby or watching me. I told myself I was just being paranoid, until I saw something on the trail. Lying on the ground was a very large, bloody deer leg, wrenched cleanly from the missing body. It was extremely fresh, still steaming, only about 30% eaten, and whatever. Had done it clearly had massive jaws. There was a strong animal smell in the air. While I cannot prove it, I am almost certain I was near a mountain lion, watching me and deciding whether to leave me alone as I passed her briefly abandoned meal. The only predators in that area were mountain lions and coyotes seemed far too small to have done that kind of damage. I kept walking slowly, afraid to run, flailing my arms and legs wildly while yell singing "Anarchy in the UK" for safety. It was the only song I could think of in the moment. Story 40. I used to work for a humanitarian organization. We were sent to a remote village to assess the damage and provide emergency assistance after it was swept away by a deadly flash flood. with the death toll rising each day. We were walking around the site with a group of men who were searching for trapped bodies when they suddenly rushed to a small mound of debris, boulders, tree trunks, and mud left by the flood, and began digging frantically with their hands and shovels. About 10 minutes later, one of them, who had crawled into a small hole they had dug, yelled at the others to stop, scrambled out, and told the group to leave. Before leaving, the man who yelled took a candle from his pocket, lit it, and placed it beside the mound. Apparently, they had heard someone calling for help, a female, according to them, and saw a muddy hand waving from a small opening. They thought someone was trapped inside, but when they dug through most of the debris, they realized the hole was just full of mud and rubble. There was no one trapped. We quickly noped out of there after finishing our work. Story 41. My house sits on the outskirts of town, surrounded by forest with fishing lakes at the end of the road. A couple of years ago, school was delayed by 2 hours, so I was home alone and had to walk to the bus stop by myself. It was bright white outside, and our driveway was long. At the end of the driveway was a one-lane road, and across it were the woods and a small drop-off. I stood at the end of the driveway waiting for the bus, and everything was completely silent. Then I heard a bell ring, like one of those tiny handheld bells. Right after that, I heard footsteps and heavy breathing directly behind my ear. When I turned around, nobody was there, but the sound of footsteps continued. I looked all around and saw no one. The yard is flat and open, so I would have seen someone running away. It still makes me uneasy. Another time, not a ghost story. It was pitch dark when I went out to catch the bus. I was standing to the right of my mom's car when I stepped forward and spooked a huge buck. It ran right in front of me. I did not see it clearly, but I remember its antlers flashing inches from my face and the rush of wind knocking me back as it ran past. Story 42. I'm not sure if this counts because I didn't actually see anything, but my subconscious must have noticed something. When I was at university, I took a night class that ended at 9:30. The bus back to my city took about half an hour, and then I had to walk from the bus stop to my apartment. There were 2 ways to get home. One was more direct, only about 15 minutes, but quite remote. It went through the woods by a huge dark cemetery. The other way took about half an hour, winding through a park, but it was better lit. I usually took the first route without thinking, but one day, after getting off the bus, I just stopped. I have no idea why, but alarm bells went off in my head, telling me not to go home. I looked around and nothing seemed unusual. People were walking around and it was a warm, pleasant night. But I was frozen. Neither path felt safe. I stood at the bus stop for about 20 minutes before deciding I was being silly and should just take the short way home. When I was only about 5 minutes from my apartment, a boy staggered out of the cemetery toward me, clutching his stomach. Blood ran down his pale face, and he was shaking uncontrollably. He said, "We have to get out of here. I just got mugged." I grabbed his arm, and we went back the way I had come. I called the police and stayed with him until they arrived. He explained that 6 men had come out of the cemetery, beaten and kicked him, stolen everything, including his shoes, and then ran off toward the park. I have no idea why I had waited at the bus stop. I'd made this trip several times a week for years. I don't like to think about what might have happened if I'd gone my usual way home. I was 19, about 125 pounds, wearing high heels after dressing up for a presentation that day. Even if I had taken the safe park route, I might have still encountered the muggers there. I felt guilty for a long time, as if I was supposed to be mugged instead. But I'm glad I was there to comfort him while the police arrived. And so glad I listened to my gut. I know there wasn't anything I could have done to prevent it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.